And good evening. It's February 4th, 2025, and we're continuing our discussion collection and our Outside the Class series. This series, it's from the Bible Project and covers the entire TaNaK, that Old Testament. On TheDustyFeet.com, in the Outside the Class section, those source videos, they're set up for your review. Because the intent of Outside the Class, if you should listen to that in-class lecture first, lectures can be found in the source video playlist. Because we want to try to keep these to about just 15 minutes. Make them easy to catch up on. So we're on a quest, scroll by scroll, book by book, a journey through this collection, but with a fun and different twist on Outside the Class, on the Dusty Feet. And before we forget, if you do find these kinds of podcasts useful, then please click the subscribe button. But the reminders, they just help you. But also, if you think these might be useful to others, that is when you click that like button, because that's how YouTube chooses to share these to more people, if they wish. So in this series, we're going to cover the entire TaNaK, right? That Old Testament. But we're going to do it in the original order of the collection, the Hebrew Scriptures order. As we've passed these first 5 already, things could get interesting. We just need to remember that these videos that we're talking about, they're just the tip of the iceberg. They're part of our learning series. I highly recommend it, and they can all be found on the Bible Project website. Link into that's in the description. We're going to ask many questions about all kinds of things. Answers? We'll see. So Judges, Shoftim, this is our part 3. So we finished last week with Othniel, right after he as a judge, and he lived and he did his thing, and 40 years of peace. You know, sometimes when I look at these scrolls, I read those stories, I see the history, I always need to remember that history can never be, not to put too much of a pun, judged by our current lens, right? Us taking our current lens and laying it over backwards. Because Tim often emphasizes the importance of examining the stories in their historical context, how they happened in that time. Because I can agree with or disagree, but I can't take where I am, literally, thousands of years later, and overlay it on how I believe it should have been done. Because this occurs throughout Scripture, not just in the scroll of the Judges, because we need to remember that this is what we need to do when we read and we try to understand these complexities in these scrolls in Scripture. Let me give you a much more current, yet very loose analogy of how sometimes that can be a little challenging. So you look back on my life as an example, and you go back and you're reading about it. It's semi-historical, and you come to say where I made certain decisions. You've read the story up to that point. Maybe you can see why I might have made a decision or two, and maybe what that was based on. It's sometimes. Sometimes it also involves looking at what's going on in the greater context. Not just around me in the physical area that I'm at, but what's happening globally. Yeah. Because my time in the military is a classic example of that I had choices. I had lots of choices, both good and not so good. But things that were happening during my military career that were parts of my choice. But when you look at the context, if you look at the time frames, what's going on in the world, where I'm at in the world, you might get a greater understanding. I'm not sure if appreciation fits, but still maybe it's at least more to consider when you're trying to understand what you're reading and or seeing. So when we get to this part, and we're looking at the scroll of Judges, and we look at what's going on, we need to have everything that's gone up to this point. Because we have the first 5, right, in those scrolls. We have the scroll from Joshua, how that happened. And now we're in this mess. So we need to go on and understand that in context as we go on. Because I have no problem addressing the discomfort of battle. It's a tricky topic. It's most often addressed from that victor's perspective. And again, I mentioned in previous episodes, this particular scroll can make us uncomfortable. Because if this were just a victor's account, it'd be challenging enough, right? But the fact that it also addresses what Tim coined the phrase failures, well, that challenges things and those circumstances. Yeah, because I'll address it. So let's discuss it. Please don't hesitate to discuss this. Because we're going to have God's involvement on both sides of this battlefield. I don't have answers to this as much as I'm willing to say, yeah, there are questions and things that we may need to ponder. Because it is that God is on both sides of this battlefield. Because the scroll of Judges repeatedly examines what God said to do, and then what was not done, and then what were the consequences. I've always been fascinated by any scroll in our scriptures willing to address these weaknesses, our failures, our frailties, our uncomfortableness of God's followers. It's their actions we see, and then maybe how we respond to them. Because I'm not sure. I'm not personally compelled that each of these individual stories are people that were meant to be emulated, right? We're meant to do these things. I think they're just there. I believe they're meant to be looked at. Because I think they're meant to be looked at with fear, trembling, and a humbleness as we look at these individuals. And here's the point, because maybe somebody's going to eventually look at us in the same frame. What I mean by that, okay, is that these people, they are attached to God's name. Do you understand what I'm doing here? Because they are, and we read about their actions and their behavior and the good and the bad consequences, they're attached to God's name. We look at them and we see God's name. We see God's attaching his own name to them. Because if God's name is not attached to them, we're less involved. Meaning they have no skin in the game because God's not part of it. But we're looking at these people and we want to see if they have God's name attached to them. How do we relate to them? Because, probably later in another video, we'll probably discuss how we could and maybe should view people in these past stories. Our level of reverence versus identification, and maybe then how we relate to their stories, and those stories relate to our lives. Because we could look at everyone from Adam to Zebulon, right? And we're looking at all these different people because sometimes we get hypercritical. Sometimes we say we want to be like them. And sometimes we try to say, well, I'll just be their good part and I'll just ignore their not so good part. Because I'm intrigued with the points that we see in the scroll of Judges, right? These judges that are inside of it. And I'm not compelled that we should look at them so much for identification as much as maybe what's happening in the story that gets us to where we are in our situation today. How might that relate? Because although we are thousands of years away from these events, these are still part of our history that needs to be examined. We must care about how they play out and how things developed beyond their individual stories, because their stories are our history. We might be doomed to repeat it. Okay, so now we can talk about Ehud. This is not a comfortable story. chapter 3, verse 12. Now the sons of Israel, again, did evil in the sight of the Lord. So the Lord strengthened Eglon, the king of Moab, against Israel, because they had done evil in the sight of the Lord. And he gathered to himself the sons of Ammon and Amalek, and he went and he defeated Israel, and they possessed the city of the palm trees. The sons of Israel served Eglon, the king of Moab, 18 years. But when the sons of Israel cried to the Lord raised up a deliverer for them, Ehud, the son of Gera, the Benjamite, a left-handed man. And the sons of Israel sent tribute by him to Eglon, the king of Moab. Ehud made himself a sword which had 2 edges, a cubit in length, and he bound it on his right thigh under his cloak. So when I look at some of these stories, I know that they're extremely short, but I still think there's a lot we can learn from them. Because we saw early that Israel, after Othniel, returned to their evil ways. Therefore, the Lord strengthened the king of Moab against Israel because they were evil in the Lord's sight. Again, this is probably going to need its own discussion later, but we realize here that God is on both sides of this battle. He's on both sides because one side is not listening. That's the uncomfortable part, because it's our side of the battle. Yeah, I said our side. Because if this is what God does, really, if this is what we see God doing, I think we might want to approach our lives with a little more humility, right? Because here's an example of how God dealing with them, shall I say us, by making things uncomfortable for us through someone else. But God chose Ehud to deliver these Israelites from the oppression of the king of Moab. Remember, these Moabites, they are only still here because Israel did not push them out of their land. They continued to let their practices stay in the land, and now they're bearing the consequences, along with their unfaithfulness. Because we've discussed this before. Their unfaithfulness to the covenant is what doing evil is. Go back to the Ehud story, right? He has a double-edged blade strapped to his leg, hidden under his tunic. I highly recommend that I encourage you to read this story with Ehud. It starts in chapter 3, starts at verse 12, ends in verse 30. Suffice to say that if you read the story, I think it's right out of a Mission Impossible episode. I know I'm dating myself here, and we're looking to have it in our current context today in 2025, but this storyline is right out of a not unfamiliar story that we've seen today in cinemas and theaters across the globe, Skip Nation. So please go back, read this. But suffice to say that Ehud, he murders the king of Moab. He escapes. And he goes to the Israeli army, right? And he says, God has given them to us. Now, the Israeli army attacks, and he defeats 10,000 Moabites. Nobody escapes. Chapter 3, 29, right? They struck down at that time about 10,000 Moabites, all robust and valiant men, and no one escaped. So Moab was subdued a day under the hand of Israel, that day under the hand of Israel, and the land was undisturbed for 80 years. So there was more peace, double the last period. But Tim and John kind of missed one judge. Oddly, he only gets one verse. Yet I suppose a movie could still be written about this one too, right? He's chapter 3. It's the last verse, verse 31. After him came Shamgar, the son of Anath, who struck down 600 Philistines with an ox goad. And he saved Israel. This is an ox goad. Yeah? That's an uncomfortable looking device. And I think later we might see a story about that and something else. It just struck me as interesting that this word, ox goad, in this story, like we have the left-handed guy, right? There, it only occurs once in Scripture. And yet I suspect, even then, that was a common word in its day. Only once in Scripture. And an ugly device, right? One verse. A man is chosen as a judge to act on God's behalf. But I believe, at the time, the people involved in this impactful and riveting story was important to them. And for us, I guess it just gives us more to ponder. So we have one more part of the pretty good section to discuss. We're going to get to Deborah. And then we wander over to the okay group. I expect it to be even messier. And we'll see how God uses everyone to respond to the behavior of those who continue to be unfaithful to the covenant. Remember, they promised. And God did too. So thanks again for being with us tonight again on another episode of the Scroll of the Judges on the Dusty Feet.